Everyone, today is Monday, January 6, 2020. This is a special meeting. As recommended by our auditor, I am calling this meeting to order. Attending our commissioners Duncan, Brooks, and Filios. Do we have any changes to the agenda? None. Moving on, the one and only and important item with a potential action. Fiscal 21 budget planning session with Finance Director Dina Darrow and staff, and Accountant Budget Michelle Charamonti. Charamonti or Caramonti? Which do you prefer?
Well, if you want to do the Italian, it's Chiaramonti.
Chiaramonti.
But
Okay.
we'll go with Charamonti.
Okay, fair enough.
It's quite lovely, it rolls off the tongue.
Take it away.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our first budget meeting of the year. So I can see on everyone's faces that everybody's very excited to start talking about the year's budget. So Michelle and I put together a key group to start talking about innovations and changes and improvements to this year's budget cycle. So today's purpose is to just get you thinking about areas where we want to focus for this year's budget, preferences that you have for this year's budget, and really have us start thinking strategically for 2021. So I sent you a whole bunch of materials and we're going to go through them fairly quickly, but this is more designed just to get you kind of thinking. And we'll do a little bit of audience participation. I did give you some sticky notes and a Sharpie so that you can write down your ideas and we can put them up on our big stickies at the back of the room. So without further ado, we will start our little PowerPoint. From the beginning. So our main goal this year is to take what we learned from last year and improve upon that, make things easier, make things more streamlined, take out manual processes, and just improve how we do the process in general. So one of the first things when Michelle and I were thinking about this was, what do other counties do? What do other organizations do? And a lot of them look to their vision statement to guide them in how they put the budget together. So one of my favorite visuals is the arrow with all the other arrows moving in the same direction as the big arrow. And this particular graphic it's all people, which I find to be interesting. And that's how we achieve our goals, is through our people. So I thought that was a good graphic for this. So this presentation is broken up into a couple of parts. The first part, we'll talk about how budget decisions and in the context of our vision statement for the county. And then talking about more strategic planning and creating a master plan for the county, if only at a high level, but just to get us thinking about the big picture more and less about details and how those details will follow the big picture if we get started on the big picture path in the right direction, the way you want to see it. And then just some feedback from you on starting the new year and what's important to you and what we should be focusing on and how we can be supporting you through your decision-making process. So here's our vision statement, and I put in a different color of blue those key elements of the vision statement that kind of apply to budgetary concepts.
Are you guys coming in?
So if we look at innovation, that's pretty straightforward, thinking outside of the box. Why do we do something that we do? Do we have to do it this way? Do we have to do it at all? And just asking ourselves those questions when we start putting the budget together. How can we make the most of our dollars? And are there things that we're doing that maybe aren't giving us the goals, they're not achieving the goals that we want to achieve? Can we reallocate those resources to something that maybe will do a better job? And then of course, cost effective. Everybody's constrained by their budgets at home, in business, here at the county. It's a constraint is something we always have to work within that framework. So again, just looking at how can we make every dollar count.
Welcome.
Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So we're just talking about our vision statement and how that aligns with our budgetary goals. So then, of course, public service, we're a service organization. How does that fit into achieving our objectives? And how can we build the best workforce to perform our services the best way in the most efficient manner? And how can we build confidence with the public, with our employees that interface with the public, and how can we make that the best that it can be? And then engaging in the budget process. We now have a social media platform. Right now we're being recorded. We can use that more to get people interested in the budget, to invite them to come to budget sessions, to invite them to watch the YouTube videos, perhaps send out surveys and ask them, what's important to you this budget season? What would you like to see? Because you as commissioners grapple with some very hard decisions, and it's very easy to sit back and armchair quarterback that, but if the public is engaged at the outset, they can say, wow, I didn't realize that this was such a complex problem. And perhaps that gets better play with the community and helps them to understand that it's a team effort, and we can't have everything we want, but if there are specific items that are important to everyone, then we focus on those. So Michelle found this visual, and I thought that it was just a nice nutshell of how we want to operate as a county. We want to be fiscally healthy, and what elements are included in fiscal health. So I sent this presentation to you. I won't linger on it, but I thought it gave us a good visual of the cycle of keeping ourselves fiscally healthy, but really just focusing on what the most important things are. And then long-term financial planning. The county has some departments that do long-term financial plans and do strategic plans, but as a county at the top level, we haven't really done long-term financial planning, so we want to add that as an element in while we're planning this year's budget. We're looking at how other counties do long-term financial planning, and rather than remake the wheel, we want to look at best practices, but we want to start building that into our budget process and start thinking, okay, the decision we make today, how does that affect us 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and really get a feeling for us as a county moving forward into, the new problems that we're going to be having. And if we look at the news, there's a lot of uncertainties, both locally, worldwide. Those could play into our budget, into our funding sources. We have a lot coming our way, so taking that long view helps us prepare. And then again, doing some financial forecasting, looking out to the future, looking at different indexes, looking at what other counties do, pulling in some statistics, start running some scenarios and seeing what are we up against. We want to be able to provide those what ifs to you during your decision-making process so that you can feel better informed. Capital is our biggest expense. Traditionally, and since I joined the county, we use a lot of fund balance to fund our one-time capital, but there are capital things that are recurring. For example, our vehicles, we're now doing a 3-year lease for our vehicles, but in order to be sustainable and not completely relying on our fund balance, having a capital improvement plan is something that we recommend, that we look at the whole of our capital and how we're going to deal with capital and plan for capital so that we're replacing things when they need to be replaced and not just buying things that we think we need, but actually having a plan moving forward for that. This is something that Michelle found that another county used. This is just an example. We're not proposing that we use this, but a lot of times groups will come forward and it's like, oh, we really need this. Well, this gives you an opportunity to score each capital request based on preset criteria. So if we were to use the vision statement or some other type of criteria, it's like, okay, how does this purchase link to our strategic goals this year? how does it fit in with our priorities? And it helps a decision maker, it takes all the emotion out of it and just fits it into a template and says, okay, does it meet these criteria? Does it pass the test for the next round? So, just one example, we can build anything you want if this is something that you're interested in using. And then performance measures, and I'm going to hand off to Michelle. She's been doing a lot with performance measures and she's been baking them into the budget book. So we want to use a more performance-based methodology in our budget asks this year. So I'll hand it off to Michelle.
Thanks. One of the things that I have learned, just going through this, like Dina mentioned, and looking at what other counties have done, is they have gone through, and it also gives, just kind of back up a little bit, but it gives the citizens an idea of how the county is performing for them. So what some of the departments right now actually gave us performance measures for the budget book that we worked on. But it allows the department head to see how well their department is performing as well, and identify areas that there may be a shortfall, or identify trends to see, well, maybe I need to react this way and go a different direction. But the performance measures really help you to understand how that department across the board is performing. And it's not, some of them are already giving performance measures to the state on specific things. So we're not asking them to recreate the wheel necessarily, but to be able to just step back, take a look at your department, find out how you can improve, and be able to show what you anticipate, look back as well as look to the future and say, okay, this is what I'm expecting next year to be like, and be able to project, as far as your performance is concerned. So as an example, just to kind of fall back on the court, we looked back to see what has been the number of certain types of cases, let's say criminal cases, from 16 through 19, and what do we project 20 and 21 to be. So that gives the citizenry, an idea of, how much are we going to need to have these people, what kind of workload are we going to have, and how many employees are we going to need to handle this, or what are we going to be able to do to support that kind of volume. So I mean, that's just kind of an example of how we can use performance measures.
Right. So here's an example of a performance measure. It's kind of hard to read, but again, and I can put this presentation up for everyone or send it out, but this is just a way for a department to look at what are the things that they do and how are they doing them and how are they performing. So, moving forward. So part of our audience participation will be for us to determine, for the board to give us some guidance on what do you want to accomplish in 2021? What are your top priorities? And in doing so, we would need your guidance on a couple of things. So we would like to start using some indexes to use to predict how much we're going to need in various areas of the budget and apply those, possibly before we even initialize the budget. So for example, if we looked at the index for fuel and decided, fuel's probably going to go up, everybody's going to need a little bump in fuel, we would just at the outset, we would bake that into the budget and we would start the budget with that. We have, well, Michelle. Michelle has designed a new capital request form. You have a copy of it in front of you. We want to help the groups focus on really thinking about why they need something, have they shopped around, are there alternatives, have they gone through the process, if there's some level of review or legal or statutorial aspect to it, that all of that has been done before it comes to you. And then, of course, if there's some things in this budget that you don't want to see, maybe you don't want any vehicle requests this year, then that's something that we can at the outset in the budget communication say, don't ask for any vehicles, we're focused on this year. With the thought of trying to save you from having to spend 2 months cutting the budget down. If you say this year, this is our focus, and all of these things don't apply, don't bring them forward. But from a capital perspective, we really want to get as much information and analysis at the outset. So when the group comes forward and says, this is why I need this, this is the analysis that we have done, this is why this is our top priority, or if we have 3 asks, this is the one that's the most important if we can only have one. So hopefully that will save time and get us the best negotiated price for an item, for example.
The second item under change capital request must include investment analysis, rate of return, cost benefit. Okay, rate of return. Define it. I understand it in the private sector, but in the context of what we do, how would you define it?
More customers served per hour. Spent on, say, a piece of equipment or on a piece of software. They're reduced overtime, reduced man hours, less need to hire a new person, that kind of stuff. So there's a monetary rate of return, there's also better customer rate of return, so they're monetary and non-monetary. That's a good question. But yes, there has to be some kind of reason for making this large investment. How is it gonna pay for itself in the long run?
Right.
Is it financial, is it non-financial, but is it quantifiable? And that then again plays into the performance measures so that it's a measurable outcome.
Challenge.
Yes.
I mean, if I bring up, well, just as an example, let me pick one. Community guardians. And our investment is fairly minimal, but nevertheless, how would you measure the return? Is it number of cases? You know what I'm saying? There are those activities that we fund that are not so easily measurable, and yet the value may be immeasurable because we're filling a very basic human need, but not necessarily quantifiable. I guess that's what I'm trying to
Well, does Community Guardians give you some kind of a progress report or tell you how many people were served or helped by your contribution dollar? Like for every dollar, so many meals are served, or you know, there might be something that they're doing to account for what their mission is, and they may have something already prepared that they do to their constituents or donors that they have, other donors. There may be some kind of a donor report. So those may already have been done.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Okay. So again, just more questions to ask ourselves. In the realm of personnel requests, it's good to start thinking about, okay, how many new people are we willing to entertain added to the payroll this year? What is the scope of that? Are you wanting to look at a lot of new positions being added? Are you thinking about maybe we don't increase overtime anymore, we roll back overtime to what it was the year before? Now, we had some overtime increases this year. Do you want to add that to the base of the department's overtime, or do you want to let that roll back? Do you want to say, well, you know, this department had a new position every year for the last X number of years, maybe this is the year because we have other goals, maybe we don't add a position this year, or what are the consequences of maybe holding off on hiring for a year? But having the departments ask themselves these questions when they're filling out their new personnel form is like, what are the consequences of not filling this position or not creating this position? So that you have a real good sense of, you know, what the trade-offs are if you have to say no. Because we all know that we want to say yes, but there's a lot of no's that have to be said to balance the budget. So again, helping you at the outset to make it easier to balance the budget. Here are some ideas. Here are just some things that we've talked about. These are some things to consider when you're thinking about those top priorities. What do we want to do about the new building? I know that we're working right now on getting the employee pay plan figured out and what those steps are gonna be, if we're gonna do a COLA, that kind of thing. We know that healthcare goes up every year, how are we gonna do that? Are we gonna invest in technology this year? Are there any services around the county that really are in desperate needs of upgrades? Do we need more vehicles this year? Do we not need more vehicles this year? Those kinds of things, these are kind of at the forefront of the big spends that you'll be approached about this year. And then assumptions. So when we look at the revenue model, we can start talking about what are our beginning revenue assumptions? What level of taxation do you want us to bake into the budget at the outset? Do we want to consider new growth as a source of income, or are we assuming that that new growth is not going to be on the table this year with the feeling of the legislature? Should we take a conservative view and say we can't count on that new growth this year, or do we just say, okay, for right now we're going to assume that we're getting new growth? Is the board wanting to entertain a COLA being calculated and steps and a bonus pool and things like that? At the outset, do we want to factor those items in as a starting budget? And then another big part of funding, because taxation is only roughly half of our available funds, do we want to reach out to the groups now and ask them to start looking at their fees? And we can provide trend analysis and have them go and look at their statutory requirements for fees. Can fees be raised? Is this something that the board wants us to look at fees, non-tax revenue sources, and see if there's areas where maybe a department hasn't raised their fees in 5 years, maybe they should look at that to help offset these costs because of our constraints with new growth or other expenses. So if that's something that the board wants us to do, we can start reaching out to the groups and say, hey, can you look at your fees? And then just generally making the budget process less painful for the groups, less paperwork, less minutia, help the board focus on the important things, drill down where we want to, but really make it a more value-added proposition. So we'll want to hear from you on what you want to see, what's important to you, where you want us to focus. And starting as balanced as possible, so you're not having to agonize over what to cut, and we have this huge gulf to cut. How can we help you start out with a lower deficit so that we can get balanced sooner, and perhaps cut a few weeks even off of the process in general, and have you enjoy more of your summer. So from a budget materials perspective, start thinking about what you want to see. Do you want paper workbooks? Do you want just electronic? Do you want things organized differently? Do you want different kind of analysis? Are there formats that you like? How much detail do you want to see? What's important to you? We want you to drive the materials that we provide for you so that you can make a decision based on the data that you want to see. And then communications. Last year, towards the end of the budget, I was reaching out to the groups and kind of letting them know and keeping them in the loop of what we're doing. If you're comfortable with that, I got a lot of good positive feedback from the groups about that, knowing, hey, I couldn't make it to the meeting, but these were today's decisions. These are how they affect you. So, and then, is there anything that you want us to stop doing? Or new things that you would like us to do? So again, just things to ponder at this point in time. Don't need to make any major decisions today, but we will be asking for some key elements so that we can start testing. We want to start testing in the test system, in the budget, using some features in the budget system that we haven't used before so we can try to automate things a little better, and getting out there and training the groups. And we talked about it, and if you are interested in some training so that you can get into the system and look at things when you want to, we're happy to provide training to you as well. We can do it on a group basis, we can do it on an individual basis, and show you how you can use the system to look things up quickly, answer your own questions, basically, or if you're curious about a certain thing, you can drill down into it and get an answer quickly. So that ends our presentation. Any questions?
Leslie, Bill?
When do you want answers to some of these questions?
I would like to, I would like to send out an email maybe sometime this week and then maybe next week. That gives you some time to kind of ponder and think about what you want to do. But today, when we do our audience participation, you can get some ideas out there and that'll get you thinking. But today is kind of just more, just throw some ideas out, some brainstorming, nothing for certain. I want us to feel free to just throw anything out there we want, just no constraint thinking, and just toss out anything you want to do. So, revenue model. So this is kind of fun. And I want to thank Stan and Rich and our friends over at the assessor's office for helping me with some of these numbers. So what I've done here, and this is just a highly summarized version, and there are some other columns hiding here. So I looked back 5 years at our budgets to see what our growth was and what made up our budget. So roughly 51% over time is non-tax revenue that feeds our budget. About 49% consistently is taxation.
Right.
So knowing that, and let me widen this just a tad so you can see here. Okay. So the green boxes represent a calculated budget figure. I can put in any options that you want for property tax, for new growth, and I've factored in the closing of the URDs based on the assessor's calculations and just on some very conservative estimates of what the values are when we come back and what the trend in our levy rate is going to be. So I've tried to factor in those next closures of URDs into our new growth numbers. So we can figure in no tax, we can figure in some tax, we can figure in new growth or not new growth. And what's going to happen is this green number will fill out according to what inputs that we're putting in, with the constant of 49% being tax and 51% being non-tax. This is an estimate of our non-tax revenue based on what the tax would be. And then estimates on what our market value will be based on prior years and what our growth is. And I'm just doing a straight line. It could fluctuate more. And then for each new year, I'm adding in the new growth plus a growth factor. So when we have, let's say, in 2021, we're going to have this big jump in new growth, then that value would get dumped into the next year's total overall value, and then that drives our levy rate. So any new growth that we get is being multiplied by the prior year's levy rate. So what I'm trying to do is just bake in a very conservative estimate of what we think for the next 5 years, what our revenue streams are going to look like. And then down here, I took an average because we don't know with our state revenue sharing with Medicaid expansion if some of these revenue sources are going to be affected. So for example, if we lost 25% of our state revenue, how much would that subtract from our total available money for our budget? Or if we lost half of our tobacco money, that kind of stuff. So depending upon how we want to build our projected revenue, that gives us an idea of our target number for our budget. And then we can start our budget closer to balanced. So we know that the budget is driven by expenses, but if we have a pretty good idea of how much money we have to work with, we can temper that. So if there's any inputs you'd like me to put in so that you can look and see what you think, you know, you want to see a particular scenario, I'm happy to put in those inputs. If you want to see more taxes, less taxes, new growth, no new growth. So that's 3% and new growth right there, with no subtractions down below.
Where are you factoring in the URD closures? Where does that appear?
Here, here,
Okay. Oh, in the new growth?
yeah.
So now you show that tailing off in 24 and 25?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Reason?
So just based on the prior years, I'm using new growth from 2020 as a baseline. Let's see, let me go into, this is the ugly one. This is the ugly version. So I'm saying that our new growth, I'm looking at a prior year, here we go. So our new growth for 2020 was 435, 979, 877, so I'm kind of using that as a baseline.
Okay, go ahead.
And then adding in one URD closure with that, adding in the two big URD closures here, and then there's gonna be another one in here. There's a couple in 2022. So I add that baseline in plus the other URD closures to get the value of the new growth, and then multiply it by the prior year's levy rate, and then it all comes over here all pretty and clean. It's still a lot of numbers. But basically, it's kind of binary. I mean, we're taking new growth, or we don't take new growth. And then we can take 3%, 2%, 2.5%, whatever you want. This is the other, I'm assuming we don't want to put anything in there.
And you know, the other side of this equation too is we have to make some assumptions about growth.
Right,
Population growth.
right,
And even though, yeah, there are gonna be recessionary years, and there always are, there's still over time, a constant in the growth rate, which I think is somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. So that, I think that has to be, if you will, the other side of the equation against which we would make any determinations. Because if you have an increase in the population, there's maybe not commensurate, but there's an increase in the demand for services.
right.
Whatever those are, okay? And so that's something that we have to take into account. The thing that's interesting is if you look at some of the tax increases historically, if you go back, I'm gonna go back 5 years roughly, not my prior board, but the one before. The year before they left office, or it turned over, they went to 0. What happened the following year? 3. Can't sustain 0. You can get away with it once in a while, but you can't sustain it in a high growth environment. That's the problem.
I would agree there. But again, this is a
But-
tool for you to project, just to get a highline projection of what kind of revenue we can expect based
right.
on those inputs. So does anybody wanna put in some different inputs just to get an answer, just for fun?
Can I just ask a couple questions
Sure.
first, so I understand what's going on up there? Like in 19 and 20, I'm looking at those columns.
Mhm.
We've got the county budget of 94 million and 101 respectively.
Yep,
The property taxes levied was the 47 million and 49, right?
yes,
Okay, and then the 53 or 50.3% and 49.1 are the calculated property tax as a percentage of budget, correct?
Yes,
Okay, so on the county budget numbers, did you back out fund balance spends or not?
no, total budget. So part of the non-tax revenue is fund balance use.
Right, but as our fund balances continue to deteriorate, they won't be available to supplement the budget,
Correct,
so the actual property tax percentage is going to be starting to spike up, right?
yes.
Okay.
But that depends on the fund balance use. This was merely just a very high level projection, but yes, you're absolutely right.
And when you did the final adjustment on fiscal 19, the amended was what, 107?
Right, but this is just based on adopted,
Okay.
starting numbers.
If you walk last week, you say that, can't notice just because. I was
And
walking from the park.
back to fiscal 19, we had an unforecasted increase of, was it 4 million and 4 million and change in additional revenue that came in at the end of the year?
Yes, there was additional revenue that came in.
Okay.
But that was grants and stuff like that.
But a lot of that was stuff that was rolled forward from the previous
From
year.
the
So the
previous
biggest,
year,
the biggest
right, right.
piece of that unanticipated revenue is the capital carry forwards.
Right.
So that's gonna be a big chunk, and then you're gonna have all your grants, and like with FTA, that same few million has been rolling forward for
Every year,
multiple years.
right.
So it kind of inflates the budget, but as far as new dollars, this more captures new dollars
Understood.
rather than
That's not the case,
capital.
yeah.
Right, so like new capital would be included in there, but capital that carried forward from a prior year wouldn't be included in.
Okay. So in that increase that we experienced, much of it I realize is grants, how much of it is actual revenue versus grants and,
Oh, I'd say maybe a quarter of it. It's not a lot.
okay, and that would be largely what, fees?
It's budget amendments, for use of fund balance a lot of times. And then, yes, unanticipated fees that came in if we have a state program or state property tax that came in that was more.
Okay, so when you say a quarter of it, a quarter of the
A
4 mil?
quarter of that whole, what, 12 some
quarter,
million,
okay.
yeah,
That's still $3 million.
yeah.
Okay,
But some of, it's a bunch of different sources mixed in,
understood.
yeah.
Yeah, I think at this point, to play around with the tax rate is premature.
Okay,
I mean, I'd love to put 0 in, just to see
Mhm.
what happens, but
I
is
say
it,
we
is it
start-
realistic?
I would say we start with new growth and put the taxes to 0, because that might be a real scenario that we're gonna face if legislature comes through.
okay,
And then what that will happen is we'll get to collect those URDs. But if we just went with straight tax increase, then the URDs would just broaden the base.
right. Do you want to adjust for any other revenue sources from the state?
Has there been any real talk about Medicaid where they're getting money?
Yeah, the governor announced in the State of the Union today that he's gonna charge counties $8.5 million for Medicaid expansion. That's what was in the State of the Union address today.
Each county?
No,
Oh.
total.
Oh, total.
And that's among the 44 counties.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
So
well,
whatever our
that's
percentage is gonna be, I
gonna
don't
happen.
know. I would think,
It may be
15%.
population based, who knows?
but the number he's proposing in his budget is $8.5 million.
Okay, so what did we just do with the 1%? Okay, so you're assuming a 1% tax increase, is
No.
that correct?
No, it's just
That's
one.
0, it's just, it's flat 1, so it would just be whatever the prior year was, we just carry that forward, so it's a 0% increase. It's just the same as last year, so no increase.
Oh, I see what you're doing, but
And
you're still
then-
taking new growth.
Yes.
Right, and taking the growth.
Rich, do you have any indication at all how we're looking for valuations? I mean, we're still on a good
We're
upward trend?
projecting upward, yeah.
Okay.
When you look at the 436 mil,
Did you
fis-
have it?
excuse me, in new growth
New
that
growth,
we had
yeah.
for this year or past year, depending on. what was the increase roughly over the year before?
I'd have to
You'd
look.
have to go back and look at it.
I don't have it in front of me.
Probably substantial,
They've been substantial, yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I'm assuming it was over 10%.
probably, yeah.
Okay. All right.
All right.
So that's at a 1% increase.
No, 0%.
Oh, 0, forgive me. I keep
0%
looking at the
plus new
one.
I know, it caught me at first too, and then she started switching numbers, and I thought, oh, there's 1.03, which is 3% increase.
You know, it's kind of interesting, somebody made the comment, I'm gonna leave the name out of it, you guys are gonna be into foregone soon. And I'm thinking, oh, you think so? Zero's what takes you into foregone. Now, I'm not saying that'll happen here, because you can pull it off every now and then on occasion. But I thought the comment was very telling, because if you want to persist at 0, we will be into foregone at some point.
It's
It
not
just-
sustainable.
It's exactly, it's not sustainable.
Unless you're doing cuts every year.
Unless you're making cuts every year, and then you get to a point where you say, well, now, wait a minute, here I'm cutting, but the population's increasing. And then the second question is, well, did those services that are on the table, you know, mandated or otherwise, let's say non-mandated, well, did they come about by accident? Or did they come about because there was really a legitimate need? And are they being funded appropriately, or maybe they're being overfunded? Who knows? I don't know.
Right,
Only an exercise would prove that.
right. And there are alternative funding sources besides property tax. That's a
true,
good
too.
question to raise. Do you do it based on demand? Is there a legislative solution? Right now, you can't be considered a resort town and collect resort tax unless you're 10,000 population or less. So we don't have the option of taking a local option sales tax or a resort tax, where we rely heavily on people from outside the county coming here and using our services. I mean, we have a huge influx of population that may not pay property tax, but enjoy the services of our area. So that's something to think about too. It's like, well, if we're limited on the amount of property tax we can take, are there other types of ways to pay for things that maybe are more demand-based, which appear more fair, because you're paying a fee for a service and people are getting something directly, they're getting a direct benefit from this cost that they're paying, whereas property tax is a little more nebulous, so there isn't that direct correlation. So, anyway, thanks for playing.
It's interesting.
So now, we're gonna shift gears a little. Oh, sample forms. So Michelle, do you wanna talk about the forms that the commissioners have in front of them?
Sure, and this is just one example. I think Dina sent it with the stuff last week, but it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier in the presentation, and just really kind of want to simplify the process as much as possible, because the other stuff is just getting unwieldy. But what we've gone through and asked the people to describe their request, their high-level objectives, identify what their dependencies or constraints are, just really kind of come back with some really good information so that you guys can make decisions based on that, and asking them to assign priority as well as identify how they're going to fund it. Is it going to be 100% property tax? Is it going to be fees for service? That type of thing. So that way you can look at it and go, I know exactly where they're going to get the funds for this. And then we're also asking, as far as the capital is concerned, we're also asking to indicate, have they gone out to other vendors? And if so, what have you negotiated? Have you even negotiated anything? And is this replacing other equipment? Who are you going to give that equipment to? If it's or is it at end of life type situation? And then in conjunction with that, as part of that entire analysis, we're asking for a cost-benefit analysis to be done with that, where you will identify, what you anticipate, your cost, your non-recurring costs and your recurring costs, so that you can come back and say, you know, this is where I think we're gonna end up, you know, 5 years down the road, we'll get our money back, or we'll break even at that point. So we just really want people to think about what they're asking for, how it's gonna benefit the county, and then also, you know, what kind of return we expect on it. And we're going to be applying that same, methodology to some of the other requests as well. So like this one was for larger capital, but anything like 5,000 to 25, personnel, asking pretty much the same kind of question, maybe not to that same degree, but basically saying you need to come to us with a well thought out reason why you need this. So we'll be putting those together. I'm still working on some of those, but I'm kind of automating them as much as possible as well. So.
Well, and this has to help. I mean, last year, when the initial request came in, at, what was it, 19 million over the year before? I mean, it was almost comical.
It's untenable.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and I don't want to see that happen again. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I would rather see us address as much as possible up front.
And that's why we're here.
I'm at a point now, if somebody comes in with something ridiculous, I'm gonna say, thank you, go back. Come back when you're more reasonable, because I don't wanna hear it. I mean, it's absurd. There's no reason for anybody to be coming in that far with a prior year. Unless we made some serious mistakes and some unnecessary cuts, and I don't know that we've done that.
I think we would have heard by now.
Yeah, I think you're right, good point.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so now that we're through all the boring stuff, now you get to play. I put up a SWOT analysis and I sent it out earlier, but basically strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So the strengths and weaknesses is when we look inward. What do we feel are our strengths and weaknesses as a county? And then opportunities and threats are more kind of an external. What are our external things? So I'm gonna ask that you think about what, maybe write on your stickies, one idea per sticky. What do you think our strengths are as a county? What do you think a great strength of this county is? And I'm putting up dedicated workforce, because we
Okay,
have a
I was
lot
gonna
of
say the
people
same thing.
here who work very hard and do a wonderful job, and they chose it because they wanted to have a job where they feel like they're giving something back to the community. Maybe they're not making as much money as they could in the private sector, but it's very important for them to have a life of service. So I think that that is a huge strength for us, because it speaks to the organization that we have.
So would you say something like benefits? Would that be one of our strengths, or you want something?
Something more, like from a visionary standpoint, as a county, what is, let's see, Michelle, help me out.
Well,
We're growing, I mean, that's.
Yeah.
Well, you've got some
well,
up there.
growth is a strength.
Yep, and that would be, let's see, what did I put up here as some ideas? Improve public outreach through our social media. That's something. We're very transparent in how we operate. And all of our fee-based services, we see every year as a trend. All of our parks, snowmobile, that kind of stuff, we always take in more money than we project that we will. So people are heavily using those things. They're responding well to our fee for services. And we see all the time, especially in our personnel requests, we have departments restructuring, trying to do more with less. We have internally, we're trying to do our best with what we have. So I see those as strengths.
I think you've captured quite a bit there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, what happened? It went away?
I didn't touch you. Nothing personal.
Okay. Okay, so I think if we scroll down a little bit, Michelle, can you help me out there?
Yeah.
So I think externally, I put down that we have a strong tax base. So,
Yeah.
let's see.
And I would say we're generally fiscally conservative.
Okay, so you wanna do a sticky for us? What sort of opportunities do we have as a county?
Growth. It's a negative and a positive, but it is an opportunity if we capitalize on it. Because it's a source of increasing revenue. And you know, it's interesting, at the same time that I'm saying that, I'm reminded of statements that I've heard, and I'm probably as much guilty as making, which is that growth doesn't pay for itself. And somebody challenged me on that the other day, and I think he had a good point. Residential growth, that is. And it's not necessarily true that it doesn't. I don't know, because I haven't seen anything, but you made a couple of good arguments. When you get into some of these higher end properties, they're footing quite a bill. And so, who knows? I still think we still need a broader commercial base, because that's what's gonna work against higher than acceptable tax increases.
So that's kind of a weakness then, excuse me.
That's
Or
a
an
good
opportunity.
point. That's a
An
good
opportunity.
point. That's an
So
opportunity.
we brought in commercial
Yeah.
base.
Yeah,
If you
I'm
can,
gonna put that as an opportunity.
go ahead, Rich.
if you consider our location,
Yes.
we have an interstate that runs, you know, east-west. We have a highway that runs north-south.
So geographic location.
We have an international airport within 50 miles.
Yeah.
We have a railroad exchange in our county. So location, we should be able to bring in growth.
That is correct.
Okay, any other ideas?
We haven't hit weaknesses, have we? Let's forget about that. No, we can't do that. You know what? I'm gonna put it up there, the state.
Okay.
I think the state's trying to find itself and find its footing, and among Medicaid expansion and new growth and some of the other things that are going on, I think the state is really wrestling.
There's a lot of
with-
Dina,
There's
I
a
think
lot
that
of-
would
yeah.
fall under threat.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, because it's external? Okay,
yep.
fair enough.
So under threats, sorry.
That's right.
The other thing is, an aging transplant demographic. We have too many people, it's disproportionate, we have too many people coming in that are older, like me.
I thought you
And
were
you.
referring to me, but.
Definitely not talking about me. I got
You're
when
not
I was
there yet.
young.
You're not there yet.
Under weaknesses, I added succession planning because we do have a brain trust here at the county and a lot of people are retiring.
Good point.
And it might be good for us to look at strengthening how
Yeah.
we do succession planning to make sure that we pass the baton to the next generation of leaders. So, anything else?
We also have employee turnover in critical areas, not just related to retirement, but
Yeah, wage competition,
Yeah,
good point, wage competition.
kind of the elephant in the room, right? That no one wants to talk about.
They, I heard on the business news just last week that the bottom 25% of wage earners in the US got it, their salaries in November went up 4.5%. Not that that's a lot when you're in the bottom 25, but it's a higher than average wage increase.
And that you mentioned that, I'm gonna put this up here. We're surrounded by 2 states that just hit
That's good.
their minimum wage went up. Washington went up to $13.50 an hour.
Are they the highest?
I'm not sure.
California is the highest.
Is California,
New York?
is New York the highest?
California and New York are pretty high. I think California was 15 something.
It's not,
It's
I,
not.
no, they were
Santa
going to get
Cruz.
to 15 by 2023.
Yeah.
Was it that far
I think
out?
so,
Yeah,
it's the
I
same
don't
way,
think
yeah.
it's that
That
high
hasn't
yet.
gotten there yet. Well, they were planning on it anyway, but they also have other benefits that the states, our state doesn't offer that California
Where's
does.
Montana? They're higher than we are.
Yeah, they just raised
Yeah.
theirs.
Okay.
Yeah. So we do have those external threats. And then I'm just gonna put uncertainty. Because, like it or not, national politics play into
Oh,
this.
that's a good point.
And, we're growing and we're roaring. What if our federal funding goes away? We depend heavily on FAA grants and FTA grants. What if those get cut?
Some of those services will go with it, though. I mean, we're not gonna have to fully fund much of what we do with the federal grants.
Right.
Well, I think if you think about how the state's funded and and its reliance on federal funds.
That's
That
correct.
waterfall
Trickles
Yeah.
down.
will trickle down to us really quickly.
Yeah, and I don't know what kind of things that all the state's funding, so that
Billions.
part.
Anybody else? Can you think of anything that's gonna drive our budget? So when we're thinking about what we're doing with the budget, how do these things play into our decision-making process?
Strengths would be law and order and the fire side, because fire side's pretty stout, pretty obscure in most of the places, and then also you're looking at a lot of local courts and the PDs and stuff.
So really,
Wage adjustments last year brought a lot of them up to a local standard, so that's a strength for us. The
another one,
weakness is the youngness of our group.
yeah, and within the area of law and order, if you wanna put it there, is our juvenile services. We do a very good job as a county.
And then the external threat is that with growth comes the unknown population coming with it. We have seniors coming, bringing family members. So you have that, a lot of,
And your staff count's been relatively constant, hasn't it?
well, last 3
Relative.
months, 4 months, but it went up tremendously, like 20% over the last couple of years.
Okay.
So, but it brings a function. The court services,
The URDs.
What is it?
And you would put that under
A threat.
threat?
Yeah.
It does siphon off the taxation from the underlying districts.
and I say, hate to say it for a threat, super fund. The word of the
You
super
know,
fund is coming
that is a
out.
very good point.
Because if that comes out, that's gonna
Very
change the
good point.
whole complexity of this county.
And by the way, probably well outside our control,
Yes.
Right, but still not effective.
but still, absolutely.
That's
You're talking
where,
about the designation, and that will be a super fund
That,
site.
this county will have superfund?
Right
County
now,
county?
One second.
with the tribe stepping out of the lake management plan, we don't know where things are going right now. So
Any EPA, right?
But the tribe has no say in whether the area is classified as a superfund or not. They're just a participant.
pressure.
Pressure.
well, they
put
said they
pressure.
would work with the county and the state to maintain some of the issues going on at the lake.
Yes.
And if the tribe pulled out of the state and the state and the county working together, now it's goes, okay, the state's gotta step in and say, okay, we're gonna have to do this, or what if what happened in the Silver Valley, it comes downhill
Yeah.
with the runoff.
So that would probably be definitely a threat
Mhm.
as far as, we wouldn't know what if Superfund is
impact,
out of the
potential
question.
impact.
Yeah, but we may start to be pressured for actual cash up front to do some work.
Because they do, like, the thing, I was looking at the paper, is like Rathdrum got hit with a $2 million bill for their roads. The state says, we're not paying it, here you go.
So infrastructure.
It's, yeah.
Yeah, we're in a little bit different situation because when you talk about roads here, you know, we have a
I was just talking about the
yeah,
billing.
that's outside our jurisdiction.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the billing.
Nancy would like to bring up legislative changes, like taking away the new growth, which is different than the state revenue sources. They are actually making decisions that could impact us
Yeah.
as a
Oh.
threat.
Good point.
I'm putting it down.
Workforce housing?
You know, that's
Weakness.
correct. Affordable housing is a threat.
Got plenty of apartments.
But they're expensive.
Yeah, the median price right now is hovering around, in Kootenai County, $315, which is fueling Shoshone now. And they're getting dramatic increases because they've been undervalued for all these years, and now they're getting some.
And they're a superfund site.
And they're a superfund site.
Hey, less of a light bill, right?
Everybody goes.
The treetops.
Well, it's 2:00.
All
You
right.
think we have enough for starters?
Yes.
Okay.
So, before we go, I want you to think about your priorities for 2021 and what you don't want brought forward this year. So I'm gonna leave this here for you guys, and I'll leave your sticky notes and your pens, so as you think of things that are your priorities for 2021, put them on your sticky and think about things that you don't even wanna hear about. to save you some time. And then we will be in touch with just updated information, and then you guys can weigh in on how you want us to kick off and start the budget. And if you wanna play around with the revenue model, or if there's any of the spreadsheets that I sent out that you wanna play around with, just give us a holler and we can come help you with that.
Okay, cool.
All right, thank you so much for your kind
You're very welcome. I guess formally I need to request or ask about public comment. None, 2:01, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.